So once again, thank you for being here. First of all, I'd like to thank the Macmillan Center program on refugees, forced displacement, and humanitarian responses, and the Order Conflict of Violence speaker series to host this event and to sponsor it. And I would like to thank Hanan al-Badawi, and also I'd like to thank Cancelo Amat, whom I've not met yet, but just via email, for inviting me to actually introduce this event. It's my distinct pleasure and honor today to be part of this event and also introduce our distinguished speaker. And as the norm, I'm just going to share some opening remarks, and I'm no expert in the field, but I'll share a few remarks, and our speaker will illuminate and thank you and enlighten us with the topic. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ezzedine Fishere, a visiting professor at Dartmouth, and also a professor of political science at the American University in Cairo. Professor Fishere has published 7 novels, 2 of which were nominated for the Arabic Booker Prize in 2008 and 2011. And he also, and I'll share a few things here, it's an extensive bibliography, an extensive biography, but I want to share a few. He teaches course on international relations theory, foreign policy theory and practice, Arab-American relations, Arabic-Israeli conflict. Prior to joining the American University in Cairo, he was a director of the Arab-Israeli project at the International Crisis Group 2007 to 2008. He was a policy advisor to the Egyptian Foreign Ministry 2005 to 2007, senior political advisor to a number of United Nations mission in the Middle East. That was between the year of 2001 and 2004, and head of the political section at the Egyptian Embassy in Tel Aviv, 1999 to 2001. He was also appointed as a Secretary General of the Supreme Council for Culture in April 2011, a post he resigned from in August and went back to teaching at AUC. Between 2011 and 2013, he served as the rapporteur of the Independent Panel on Reforming and Developing League of Arabic States, chaired by Lakhdar Brahimi. And also since 1995, Fishere has published, as I said, novels, bunch of articles, and his research interests are in global politics, governance in divided societies, Arab-Israeli conflict, Arab political thought and culture, and of course what we're going to be talking about here today, which would be Arab state fragility and failure and collapse as the so the topic of today, Arab state fragility, failure, and collapse, as they relate in particular to the political developments in the Arab world in the last few years. State fragility, of course, encompasses a wider range of domains, from social and economic inequality to failure to provide opportunities for young citizens, to security crises and the disregard for basic civil rights, such as the right to free expression, right to self-determination, states that are fragile often stagnate or spiral into violence. The state function, albeit barely, to different set of socio-political dynamics and often create obstacles to stability, development, and democracy. Over the last decade, the issue of state fragility has vaulted up the foreign policy of numerous nations, yet there is little consensus of how to identify or assess a failed state. Should it be measured only by bad governance? What comes to mind often also is the term that Grendel's term, enough good governance. Some countries display fragility only when moments of crisis arrive. Thus, there has been a plethora of definitions, and the often cited one, and I want to just bring attention, what comes to me when I read the title, I'm thinking about the failed state index. There is an index, foreign policy index, where nations around the world get a ranking. And if I believe the latest one probably was in 2015, where they're ranking 178 of them by ranking, and it's according to 12 social, economic, political, military indicators. And there is, to cite a study by Blake Honchell, piece on the failed state, frequently asked question in mythology. And these 12 social, economic, political indicators are peace, wars, peace accord, environment, calamities, political movement, stability, and others. Understanding fragility is further undermined by the reality that crises periodically challenge all states, and I quote here, strong or weak. This fragile moment in which a country struggles to overcome a shock or long-term inadequacy that threatens its most basic institution are most devastating to states that lack the resilience to adapt. Another point that has been discussed at length is the length of fragile states. The length varies substantially. It could be months, could be years, could be decades, and the understanding why it takes less in certain nations than others is a key, and I quote here, to differentiate between a resilient state. Few symptoms of fragile state: dysfunctional institution, corruption, governance, illegitimate political order, political fragmentation, weak governance. The protests that shook the Arab world, bringing dictators down from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya in such a short period of time, all took place within a context of both authoritarianism and state fragility and failure, both of which have a long history in the Middle East. Throughout the region, liberal adjustment and growing dogmas, privatization, deregulation, neoliberalization have forced state to begin to dismantle the welfare state that offered citizens incentive to accept the state's claim to legitimacy. Trends beginning in the 1980s reached their boiling point during the so-called Arab Spring, but throughout this period, movement decrying the lack of economic opportunities for young Arab men and women began to take shape. New technologies, changes in the source of space for political information and activism have defined the current political terrain, as well as defined the contours of political mobilization and transformation in the region. So, for instance, Professor Fisher shared with me a few notes in terms of like talking about the TV satellite internet that followed the transnational media conglomerates such as Al Jazeera, provided new platform political programs of all kinds and increased the scope and reach of certain political ideology in the region. The role of social media, Twitter, Facebook, especially under the condition of state-controlled newspaper and television, cannot be overlooked. Activists creatively used Facebook to disseminate images of the state crimes in Egypt, for instance, when the face page Kullina Khalid Saeed, we're all Khalid Saeed, drew attention to the brutal murders and disfigurement of a young Alexandrian. Across the Arab world, personal blogs become political sites where activists articulated vision of alternative political and social futures. The self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, catalyst for the Tunisian Revolution and ensuing Arab Spring, came to define a new tactic of protest in Morocco. They cried electoral corruption, political censorship, and state brutality. In each case, activists issued powerful calls for a more just governance and boldly staked claims to human treatment and dignity. The result of protests came to be defined by the particular structure of the state, the relationship between the military and the ruler, the degree of centralization, the existence of foreign backers from various sides. That's the question of state fragility, which had so long been depicted academically with regards to countries with poor institutions, lack of political freedom, security crisis, was in many cases directly demonstrated by the fall of Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and has been contradicted by the persistence of Assad or Khalifa family in Bahrain. What explains these outcomes? The present crisis in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Iraq, which have reached harrowing levels of human suffering and displacement, have precipitated political challenges in and outside of the region. The transformation of this site into proxy wars cannot be overstated. In Yemen, United States-backed Saudi military campaigns implicate many Gulf countries in what began as political movement, but what quickly transformed into brutal and ongoing sectarian conflict. And there is Syria, which lays at the intersection of various interrelated contestations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, regimes in the plural, between Sunni and Shia, between Russia and the United States and Turkey and Hezbollah. Revolts that began with calls for social and political freedom became sites for the operation of global statecraft, foreign military support, and at every turn more violence. As the battlefield radicalizes insurgent groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda came to fill the vacuum left by the nobler forces without the same strength, organization, and conviction. In the West, influxes of migrants and refugees from affected areas have contributed to a growing trend towards nativism and xenophobia, reinforcing right-wing movements of all kinds and producing electoral victories that threaten various aspects of the international order. Probably one of the other thing, but I think the speaker might also talk about is the issue of like resilient versus fragile state. But I want to just say a couple of things about the notion of democracy and this prism through which we can look at things that people would ask for. Terry Carl defined modern democracy as a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through competition and cooperation of their elected representative. And Dahl therefore identifies 7 criteria that citizen democratic should have: control over government decision, fair and free election, universal adult suffrage, the right to run for public office, freedom of expression, access to alternative sources of information, free manipulation of political powers, and freedom of association. It's our hope that we might begin the conversation talking about all different subset of this topic. Therefore, please join me in welcoming Professor Ezzedine Fishere with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. How much time do we have? 10 minutes, 10, 12?
So we have till 1:30, but we won't, as long as you want the discussion to proceed.
Okay, so maybe 15 minutes, and then we have the second half for a conversation. I'll try to go straight to the point, and my point is I suggest that paying more attention to the question of state fragility and failure would be useful in understanding important aspects of both the struggle between authoritarianism and democratization on one hand, but also understanding the deteriorating security situation in the Middle East on the other. And simply put, as Jonas pointed out, state failure means one or more of 4 things, according to the most basic and classic definitions, especially adopted by the Fund for Peace, which publishes this state failure / state fragility index every year. And those 4 things are loss of control over territory, that's 1, erosion of legitimacy for governance institutions, 2nd, inability to provide public services, and inability to act as a full member of the international community. Now, these are clearly scales. These are not binary distinctions, which means there is ample room for disagreement on where would a state fit, if it's in fragile or already failing or failed and so on. But they're useful indicators. And regardless of how how you define it, if you look at the fragility state fragility index of 2016, you will find that all Arab states, with the exception of Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, and Oman, all the others are in either the yellow, the warning, or the orange-red zones. So all of them are already in the fragile going to failed states categories. They have, it's a complicated index. They have 12 indicators. I'm not entirely sure about how reliable this is. If if the conclusion is that Saudi Arabia and India are in the same category, I have doubts. But again, it is a useful indicator. Now, Arab states have always been weak states or fragile in the sense that they never managed to carry out these tasks, these 4 tasks adequately. They never managed to build strong and effective and legitimate institutions that can carry out these tasks. In particular, Arab states, with varying degrees, and the variations are important, were incapable of managing political and social conflicts through the political and social institutions that they have, including the informal ones. Although, once again, the informal institutions prove to be, in most of the cases, better for performing than the formal ones. See, for example, Jordan and Moroccan successes compared to the others. Now, the weakness of Arab states, again, which is, goes back to the inception of Arab states itself, have been shielded by a combination of Cold War politics, natural resources boom in some cases, and in all the cases, a rallying cause, the famous question of Palestine. But then the Cold War came to an end. Natural resources, the boom is under pressure, mounting pressures, and the Middle East peace process managed to discredit Arab states as public mobilizers for Palestine. And more significantly, the social and cultural change accelerated significantly since 1990. TV satellites, internet, all of the new communication media broadened the socialization process of the new generations and broke the national monopoly on forming social and political attitudes. So those who filled the Arab squares in 2011 were born somewhere between 1990 and 1980 at the earliest, which means that the youngest among them were 8 years old when they probably saw or heard that US President Bill Clinton was getting impeached for lying about getting a blowjob in his office. Now, this might seem like a trivial example, but in a conservative society, politically and socially, conservative societies, opening the socialization process to issues like this meant that taboos were being discussed. Taboos were no longer taboos. They were being discussed and tackled, and other examples of governance have been communicated directly to the people. So you could see competitive elections almost everywhere in the world, except in their countries. This generation could see population under actually military occupation organizing competitive elections, and they're not. So the norms and values, which are the basis for behavior, for rules and for political behavior, for political attitude and social attitudes, were changing, and changing in a way that is inconsistent with the practices of Arab states and their institutions. At the same time, state fragility or weakness deteriorated into outright failure in many cases: Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, at least. Somalia, of course, was ahead of the curve with outright collapse since 1980s. However, the Arab states managed to drag the fragility and failure, the length you pointed to, for many more years without actually collapsing. But this happened mainly thanks to a combination of selective repression, but also abandoning control over enclaves of social interactions that the states deemed unthreatening for their overall control, and of course selective cooptation and the continued threat of radical Islamism. But even these controls were becoming fragile. And the conflicts simmered and accumulated outside the institutional framework, and resentment piled up, grievances grew, until a tipping point was reached in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, Syria, and even Saudi Arabia in 2011. So now the famous Arab Spring was in full swing. Now, whether people went to the streets because they wanted employment, or wanted bigger share of revenue and wealth, or wanted political freedoms and accountable governments, or went to the streets because of identity-related demands, ultimately, the millions of Arabs who took to the streets emphasized with these who, and those who empathized with them, who didn't go to the streets, they have one common denominator, which is they all wanted a functioning state. The claim, the demand that everyone seemed to share is, this is not working, whatever this is, it's not working, we deserve better, we want a functioning and effective governance and a state. obviously dysfunctional institutions which could not process regular social and political conflicts were even less capable of processing extraordinary conflicts like those of the Arab Spring. Certain states collapsed altogether, Syria and Yemen. Other states almost collapsed, Libya. Some witnessed military interventions, Egypt. Others managed to float without really addressing any of the challenges it's facing, Tunisia. And notably, the most effective states among them, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, each for a different reason, managed to contain the conflict and to suppress it in Bahrain with the help of. Now, the states which collapsed, such as Syria and Yemen, are gone and will be gone and will be a security challenge for a long time to come. And there is no security response that is adequate in the face of a collapsed state. There is nothing you can do when a state collapses. And if you have doubts about that, look at Somalia. Look at the long list of attempts to deal with the security consequences of its conflict over the last 30 years. We have pirates for heaven's sake. Now, it is my claim, if my claim is valid, if Arab states suffer, all of them, from varying degrees of fragility or failure, then we should be worried not only about those states that collapsed, but also about the others which did not yet. How is Libya going to become a functioning state? And if it doesn't, what does this mean for security in North Africa and the Sahel region, which is already simmering with multiple challenges that are how will political and economic institutions in Egypt face the challenges of 1 million young people demanding new jobs and housing, etc., every year, and getting a right to vote as well? If its current budget has 12% deficit, now the government's hoping to bring it down to 11%. And this is with an extraordinary financial support, including budgetary support, over the last 3 years by Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. An accumulated debt of $60 billion, according to the Central Bank of Egypt. How will it maintain current level of public spending? And note, the current level of public spending is the level under which people took to the streets asking for bread and better services and so on and so forth. So the best you can hope for is to maintain the level of public spending that you had in 2011, which was not sufficient. Now add 6 years with 1 million demanding jobs and services and so on every year, do the math. And I'm not, that is without referring to the segments of society that are disconnected from governance and state institutions because they are either extremely upset or depressed because of the failure of Arab Spring. Now, the same applies to the other countries that survived. But even the stable countries like Saudi Arabia face similar questions about its future. Now, we have a lot of literature on state failure, and we have a lot of literature on state building. Most of it tell us that state building doesn't actually work, that it's rare that the state building process achieve its goals. But we have very little on reversing state fragility or state failure. And this should be, I think, a priority for research in the Middle East. The question here is no longer why or how states fail. We've done that, we documented it, we're very good at understanding it, how it fails. Perfect. The question is how and under which conditions can state fragility or failure be reversed? Now, I have few preliminary remarks on this research question because partly this is a nascent, for me, that's a nascent research project. And I appreciate, obviously, this is why I'm here, appreciate your comments and guidance and questions on it. Now, the 2011 World Bank report on development, it's called Conflict, Security, and Development, deals with the question of state fragility in depth. It claims that it is possible to reverse state fragility within a generation. But it requires for that to happen a committed national leadership and a refitted international community. So the first question, the first problem is recognition by national leadership. Now, national leaders in failed or fragile states often do not recognize that their states need deep reform, if not full reformatting of the state in order to survive. And if you don't overcome the problem of recognition by national leaders, there is very little that you can do from the outside. Look at, from George Bush 2005 democratization, but also the Barcelona process by the EU, which tried to overcome reluctance. Okay? And there is very little you can do from the inside, because then you're faced with repression, or as Leonard Cohen said, 20 years of boredom for trying to fix the system from within. So, first problem is recognition. Second problem is, even when you have recognition by national leaders, usually this recognition doesn't translate in a reform program. It doesn't, because state institutions which are supposed to carry out the reform are overwhelmed by the challenges they're facing on day-to-day, and they have no energy or resources left to deal with deep reform. Second, repression and corruption. And repression and corruption, they become a modus operandi of state institutions. They're not deviations. They are a replacement for functioning SOPs and for functioning rules for institutions. But then repression and corruption create their own or consolidate their own constituencies. And then they become special interests that resist reform. Three, obviously, lack of resources, both in terms of funding, and that's the usual one, but more importantly, the lack of capable cadres who can lead state reform. Most of those countries think or live under the impression that there are experienced people, and it's just a political will question. So if you decide we will do reform, you'll bring all those experts and they will do reform. And guess what? You don't. If you have an educational system that is failing over 30 or more years, how come you will have an experienced expert who can do reform? Where would they come from? Think those who worked in Iraq or those who worked in Libya on transitional justice. Where would you get judges? If you want to reform transitional justice, where are you going to get qualified judges who are not part of, and even who are part of the old, but who are qualified judges? And then, ultimately, there is a narrow mindset. And the narrow mindset is a result of the failure, of an accumulated failure. But, but then you have, even when national leaders understand that they need reform, and sometimes they say it publicly, but then their definition of reform is so narrow, then even if you bring them the best laid out plans for reform, and with unchecked power, they will ultimately derail those processes and turn them into something smaller, something partial, something that actually doesn't address the problem. So those are the problems. I know. I said we need to think of how to reverse, and then I explained those are the problems why you can't reverse. But there are cases of actually reversing state failure under existing conditions without an overarching political transformation. And I can't speak for other countries. I know cases in Egypt, but those are cases that are very limited. They are specific sectors that were on the brink of failure or actually failing, and those are important sectors. For example, the the real estate registration department, or civil affairs department, where it was almost impossible for citizens to get a birth certificate. It's a lengthy and complicated process and very frustrating. Now you can get it literally in 5 minutes by the same people. No one was laid off. No one was fired. No one was hired that is qualitatively different. And somehow, some departments managed to transform themselves. Now, this is not a glaring story of success. This is not something that would, but at least I think there are lessons we can learn about reversing state failure from looking at micro cases of reform that actually worked. And to end, I think also two other issues. One is maybe if we shift the political conversations inside those states from focusing on the fight over freedoms and rights to focusing on how you make state work. So even if you went to the streets because you went to the streets for whatever reason, including that you wanted a functioning state. Functioning state includes a functioning where governance is, where you have a rule of law. But then how would you bring about rule of law? That's part of reversing the failure. How would you turn the security sector or the law and order enforcement sector into a functioning, effective rule of law? How would you actually do this? And this is a different conversation from the political, symbolic conversations about I want my rights, and the other side says, well, no. And then you go to protest and so on and so forth. And I'm saying shifting the conversation is important because in some moments during Arab Spring, actually those who called for freedom had an opportunity to shape governance, but then they were incapable of transforming the state institution that they briefly were in charge of. So the problem is not just a problem of authoritarianism. It's authoritarianism reflects something deeper that we need to think of how to reverse it rather than demanding its reversal. I know Hanan would object to that. And the last question is the obvious one about the international community and whether we can look at donors' conditionality in a different way, where conditionality is transformed into an element of reversing, an element in a broader strategy to reverse state failure. That's a longer conversation. But ultimately, I think we need to bring researchers from development, and especially institutional development, together with researchers from security and from those who work on authoritarianism and democratization, and have, if this is interdisciplinary approach to state fragility and failure, maybe out of this we can find a way to address reversing state failure itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll probably open the floor to questions.
Can I have the papers you promised?
Absolutely.
All right.
I can use this too.
Okay, thanks.
If not, I could start with
That's
a couple. Any questions, remarks?
Actually,
I can
start.
ask. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I knew it.
Can I have the mic?
Sure.
So, like for me, I found the factor of state-society relations in the state functionality aspect not quite regarded in this aspect, because like in terms of economic indicators, for once in 2011, definitely Egypt was doing like much more better than today, but people were not satisfied. So like part of the debate about the rights was not just about functionality in terms of measuring functionality, but also in terms of how citizens relate or do not relate to this prosperous economic indicators. Second thing is like on the grand scale of things. Like if we are talking about that what was lacking was a process of reform, like there was those couple of years of like the Great Middle East initiatives and like the Tunis Declaration for Reform and like...
We'll make it great again.
Yes. So there was like this couple of years, I think it was the window right after the Iraq war that was between 2004 and 2006, where like everybody was talking about reform in the Arab region, and it actually did not happen. So that's also like in my thinking is why does it, like if this is what we require to combat fragility, why is it not happening?
before, probably more question, and we open the floor. I was hoping that you could say something about the external intervention. And what I really mean by that, often the conversation that you have, all the narratives in the Arab world among sometimes elite and not even elite, is we're at a state where you see that this state on the brink of collapse because of some sort of external intervention or foreign intervention. I'd like to hear something about that. Then the second issue that you mentioned, which I absolutely agree with, one thing that should happen initially is the recognition of the leader that it's a fragile state. It needs to be. However, what you see in the Arab world a lot, and I can give a lot of examples, most of the leaders don't think it's a state that it's fragile or weak or collapse, but most of the time you hear the narrative, دولة الحق والقانون. Would be here like al-Qanun, like you have actually like the law and it's the democracy, and you hear so many slogans. Slogans can be in the media itself, and it's often repeated. You also would have, and this is another important, you have like political actors by the media itself, and you have the state media, which elevate or heighten that discourse. It's a very functioning society. There are no problem with it, and you often talk even to common people, being in Egypt or Jordan, other places, and I've seen this a lot, and all the slogans of, they don't really see that there are certain issues there, and that's a very good point, because when you think about the rulers being in Jordan, in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, they think they're on the right path, there's no problem with it. So the fact that there is no recognition that there is work to be done and improvement creates a huge issue to reverse the state, let's say, on the brink of failure, to a state that might be somewhat actually functioning. And we probably open the floor to questions or comments.
I have a comment about that, what you just said. Why do you think that leaders do not recognize the current
That's
No, think about Syria, where, you know, they have 5 branches of the Mukhabarat for that reason. How do you keep propping yourself up by having more and more? Huh?
Well, one of the things what Fisher, if I could probably say this, like Professor Fisher, is he said like initially you knew what you want to do in university, you have to have some sort of recognition. Maybe Syria as probably the example you made, but I can give you other examples. Like for instance, in other states like Algeria, Tunisia, like other places, Morocco itself, and you do have a lack of recognition, meaning that people that get involved, they often not knowing that this state is on the brink of failure. But we'll let to Professor Fisher to comment on that.
Do you want me to respond right away, or
if there are more questions, probably we'll take more questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And I want to ask, in light of our conversation, how do you see this implements in the Palestinian territories, and what do you predict in terms of your analytic?
in Palestinian territory?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I was wondering, how did I'm still unclear as to how the rights-based and the technocratic-based programs go with one another. Because it seems from that you have the Arab Spring and a bunch of revolutions, and the reasons why the political program failed was because the state wasn't strong enough for them to succeed, basically. So is the solution that we need to strengthen the state, and then these places will be ready for things like rights and democracy and elections? And is that a realistic program? I mean, is that...
I walked in late, so I apologize if I missed something, but where does political Islam fit into your picture? Is it a source of fragility? Is it a source of rebuilding? I mean, it's remarkable that we've had a wonderful lecture about Arab world without a discussion of the role of political Islam.
I wanted to just ask what your opinion is of U.S. and U.S. aid to either supporting and perpetuating state fragility versus rebuilding, which I know is a very relevant policy question today in Washington. Would you say maintaining and strengthening U.S.-Egypt ties, for example, versus reducing and cutting aid and support until reformation happens?
Okay. Could I
Go ahead.
try
Yeah.
these and then we go for a second round? Okay. I'll go in order. Hanan, I think obviously state-society relations is what state fragility is about. For a state to be effective, you need, all those three of the four criteria are related to state-society relations. You need legitimate institutions, you need provision of public service, and governance, right? Now, what I mean by a functioning state is not a 7% economic growth rate. You can have a 7% economic growth rate, as was the case in Egypt in 2010, and you still have a fragile or failing state. If you have an effective state institutions mean that you provide services that people find that the majority of the population is receiving and finds minimally acceptable, that you have institutions that deal with the public and the public find them legitimate. So it's impossible to have, so the rate of economic growth has very little to do with that, okay? Now, the projects of reform, like the Greater Middle East, the Greater MENA, the Barcelona process, and so on, show the limitation of what the outside players can do if national leaders do not recognize that their states are fragile and need deep reform to survive. Each of these projects suffered from particular weakness. The Greater Middle East and MENA, the US-led effort, was focused on elections. And that is flawed because that doesn't address the issue of state fragility itself. That doesn't make institutions, elections alone do not make institutions more resilient. But also it increased the paranoia of national leaders in the way they dealt and they saw this reform project. And none of these reform projects worked, all right? But it doesn't mean that that the way of reform itself is not the way to try to reverse state failure. There is no other way of reversing state failure that we know of except rebuilding those institutions. And there's part of your question that joined the gentleman's question, so I'll address it at the end. Now, external interventions and recognition. Again, the question of recognition, if national leaders do not recognize the problem, I don't see what you can do. I don't see what outside players can do. Again, because national leaders are often paranoid, right? And I don't see what domestic players can do unless they manage to change the recognition. And that's one of the main obstacles, because if the leaders are trapped in groupthink, which is often the case, then even those in the leadership who begin to question the consensus that we're fine are immediately casted out, right? So this is $6 million question, how to get the recognition. Now, external interventions, it depends what you mean by external interventions. And that joins your question as well. I don't think the US or any external intervention creates state fragility. It does not create state fragility. I think it would be unfair to say this. External intervention prolong, sometimes shield state fragility, allow states to continue to float which they wouldn't be able to do without external intervention. And for me, that's a political issue. It's not a moral issue. Outside players will continue to intervene because they have interests. That's the way international politics are. So the question is, can you align external intervention with some approach to state failure reversal, to reverse state failure? Can you do this or can't you do this? And how can you do it? Those are the only legitimate research questions that I can think of. Palestine. I don't know. I think Palestine and Palestinian territory is a separate and compounded case because the occupation element kind of blurs everything else. But you know what? Beneath the occupation element, there is a problem of fragility as well. If you look at the PA institutions, how different is, and if you look at the history of the PA institutions, in the moments, in the brief periods where the PA had more leeway and more margin of maneuver to act, it replicated Arab states' behavior. And the Palestinian civil society suffered accordingly, right? And look at Gaza, before and after Hamas. So the problem in Palestine, I suspect the problem is the same, but we have this layer of Israeli occupation that kind of makes things a little bit unclear, right? Yes. Now, the key, I think, to clarify what I said, and I get this reaction often, which means I need to do more on the clarification part, is that reversing state failure and reform are not technocratic issues. Those are not technical issues. Those are eminently political issues. You cannot reform states, you cannot reform Arab states by a technocratic attitude. The IMF can do some stuff in fixing public finances. That's probably useful. But you cannot reform state institutions, make them legitimate, make them effective through a technocratic process. It's all political, from A to Z. And this is why technical reform doesn't work. That's the Leonard Cohen option, because you're stuck. Now, the other question that you asked, I refer you to Francis Fukuyama's book, 2014, I think it's called Political Order and Decay. And in his book, he talks about the sequence between the sequence of democratization and building effective state institutions. And his argument is states that manage to build effective state institutions first and then democratize tend to be effective functioning democracies, while those who go the other way face difficulties afterwards and fall more easily into neo-patrimonial politics. And he uses he has a lot of examples. Two of them are very interesting, the United States and Britain, and how in both cases, state institutions were dysfunctional for about a century. And that the reform, it took Britain about 100 years, it took the US less because it came afterwards, but that both polities went through a long and difficult process of reform that is political, not technical, and that ultimately led to recovering effectiveness in both cases with more success in the UK than it is in the US. And he points to some of the features of US state institutions today that still carry the weight of the old dysfunctionalism. So, but again, Fukuyama doesn't tell us how you can reverse the process, how you can push the reform process. In the case of the US and the UK, those two long processes of reform, which were again political, happened because there were social and economic changes that created elites and social classes that adopted and pushed for reform and snatched it from the ruling elites. If you don't have this, as in the case of Arab states, how can you organize it?
You have one about political Islam.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's reproducing what you was worried about, what you were worried about. I think I'm almost certainly on the minority in this, but I think that we passed the moment where political Islam is the key to understanding the Arab world and its politics. I think political Islam remains a challenge. It's one of the challenges that states are facing. I don't think it's neither the answer nor the problem. And I think, again, that the experience of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt showed that the problem is not as much political Islam as it is building effective state institutions.
But if you're concerned with legitimacy, which you mentioned in every other sentence, it may not be the key, but it has to play a vital role in reversing processes of failure.
This is where I am on the minority. I don't think so. I don't think legitimacy of state and its institutions today in the Arab world is linked to identity and political Islam issues. And I think
Hard to know.
it's hard to know.
No, I mean, Egypt, they're all in prison, so what do we know?
Exactly. Not only they are in prisons, but also we don't have statistics and public opinion, reliable public opinion. We don't have a reliable understanding of public opinion. So here I'm out on a limb that is based on my lived experience throughout those years, but I stand to be corrected. But in the absence of this clear understanding, I'm putting out a claim. It is not this is why I have all those disclaimers I'm making. This is what I think. It is not a demonstrable argument yet, right? But I think during this, I would say, year and a half of Muslim Brothers in power, a lot of the people who supported them moved away, not from supporting the idea and identity issues, but it's just like, okay, so what? You have a beard and you're pious and all of that, but it's not working. The services are still not working, and you don't seem to have a clue how to make it work. And you know what? This is my problem. And again, in support of my, not exactly an argument yet, but claim, the numbers who went out against Morsi in June 30, those are real numbers. And I don't think you can explain this only by brainwashing, manipulation that was done, but it wouldn't explain all these numbers on its own. I think people were disappointed on governance grounds, that this is not a functioning governance, and what we need first is a functioning governance in the sense of security, but also in the sense of public services and so on and so forth.
I was going to say I appreciate you in sort of bringing the state back in, because I think a lot of what happened in 2011, 2013, I can't speak for other Arab countries, that it wasn't sort of necessarily just a liberal demand of get the state off my back. It was a little bit more complicated, and especially in 2013 you could make the argument, although there was overlap between folks who rallied to the squares in 2011, 2013, but there was also different people and different segments, etc. But there was something about sort of the demands about the state that was just not the, get it off my back. There was something more. So it's sort of a good start. But I'm kind of in the technocratic box. I think even just the use of word reform suggests to me that this is very much a technocratic project. Even if we take a sort of a deeper political view of things, it's just I don't know what the line is between reform and revolution, right? Because if you need a political process that will reconfigure the classes and groups on which the system sort of depends, then that's not necessarily.
No, it would reconfigure the state. You cannot reconfigure the society.
The state-society sort of relations. You can say Egypt today, or any other countries in the Arab world rests I mean, in terms of legitimacy, but in terms of functions on certain territories, certain classes, certain elite groups, a coalition of a certain type of bureaucracy with some sort of neoliberal business, big business, etc. You can, and some middle class. You can make these arguments, and for the wider political reform you're taking, I think it would take more of a revolution in terms of, okay, they have to depend on other classes.
Here's my problem with this approach. I agree with you on the importance of these issues, of course, but here is my problem is, in the experience of probably more Egypt than the other parts of the Arab world, because they, this is we have a longer and more changes in the case of Egypt. The focus on this, on the coalitions and on the state-society relations, led to focusing the political debate almost exclusively on who gets to rule.
Or at least who gets what, right? Like,
who gets to rule,
correct.
And who gets what in terms of demands that I am entitled to, okay? And very little, if any, on how to rule and how to get you to get what you claim that you're entitled to. So in the entitlement discussion, by 2013, the majority said, all right, yes, we're all entitled to this. How can you make it happen? No one has an answer. And I know it's a bold statement, and I stand by it. In the case of Egypt, none of those who were the political competitors, not the ones in power, not the ones in jails, not the ones locked at home, none of them has an answer, or, in my view, is even considering coming up with an answer. Everyone assumes that the answer is obvious. It's just like, once you control the state, you will make it work. I don't think it works.
Professor, if I may be allowed to follow up, if you don't compare, say, Egypt to Somalia, and they just like look, I don't know, a couple hundred kilometers north and say Greece, you would
as an example of failure, or?
But you wouldn't use, state fragility. I mean, maybe state fragility, but you wouldn't necessarily use the word state collapse. But you would have, minus political Islamists, less sort of obviously issues of democracy, but very much the same issues that you identify about state functioning. So
about fragility, yes.
So in that sense, I mean, why is this an Arab
It's
case?
not an Arab.
And if it is a liberal democratic problem or just a neoliberal problem, I mean,
it's a state problem. It's a governance problem. And you're right,
but
Greece.
no one has a clue.
But that's exactly why you need a research question. Is, and again, if you look at the Fukuyama's book, Greece and Italy are prominent examples. Now, how can you increase resilience in the case of Greece? It's the same question, right? Now, if you know anyone working on this, please send me the reference, because I am looking for work that is done on reversing, on how you reverse state failure. And again, it's a political question. Think of Greece, think of Egypt, think of any case of similar case. The answer has to be political. It is not. And this is why the World Bank report of 2011 is what it is, because it assumes the political issues are resolved. Say, recognition of national leaders, international community cooperates, fixed.
I'm confused by how you're still emphasizing that it's a political answer when in the beginning, or when you were still talking, you mentioned micro cases of reform, and that is what I assumed you were saying. These are models that we can hope to, and I'm guessing those small micro cases were technical in nature.
Yeah, those are technical, and my point is, they're not models, but those are cases that we can learn from. Those are cases that can tell us something about possibilities and conditions of institutional development. But those are not going to teach us much about the bigger political issues. But they are useful. Yeah, they're not entirely apolitical, because when you restructure a service, there are issues about the people in the service, about labor laws and what you do with that and so on. So there are political issues. There are questions about how much authority you give and how much independence you have from the bigger issues. There are questions about how you deal with repression and corruption and its vested interest and players. So there are political questions. But those are not the cases that will give us the answers to the bigger political question. But they are also useful. And it was at the end, not at the beginning, because I just tried to find something.
Yeah, this I think piggybacks a little bit on the one that was just asked. But, you know, looking back at the Arab Spring, it's cottage industry to ask why some countries, you know, why some regimes, you know, survived and some did not. And just sort of to think, I mean, you've yourself said there is variation within Arab states in terms of fragility. You know, is there places that we can look? Are there some cases? For example, Jordan, to my mind, would jump out as a place that has been surprisingly resilient in the wake of everything. But is there anything that you can say, or you would say, for those working on this in terms of which cases give us some more insight about what possible answers are out there?
Okay, I think the case is that the variation would tell us about the degrees of state resilience. And obviously, it's demonstrated that Jordan, for example, Morocco is another example, and I'm trying to stay away from the rich ones because the obvious answer, we're not sure, but that could be the answer, but okay. But also they have informal institutions that are more resilient, right? So if you're mapping out, you can safely say those are more resilient than these. But that statement does not answer the question how you get the less resilient to be more resilient. And this, I think, is the question that I'm trying to push forward. How you turn a less resilient state into a more resilient one.
So would you qualify, or probably the case of Jordan and Morocco as being less resilient, to more resilient? And if I would probably just ask more about those specific cases in Jordan and all that, one of the things that probably also, like, thinking about the role of the monarchy, having both actually, you know, countries being ruled by a king, and also I just want you to say more about that in terms of what more resilient in terms of what, in terms of what are the things that made them kind of, probably this question you've been asked a lot, survive what happened in other places. So they're not, so for instance, if we think about Jordan and we think about Morocco, for instance, like what happened in Tunisia went straight to Egypt, but you also have stuff going on in Morocco February 20th. So we have the people took to the street, a lot of people asking pretty much, I would say, the same thing. It's not really exclusively different because they're still asking about jobs, they're asking about having a better life, they still ask about the functioning state. And the only reason I'm asking this question, if we look at the example of Morocco right now, you have a government where they didn't have a government for almost 4 months. There is no government in Morocco right now. And I just kind of like, so there is not really something that's functioning still till now there.
State institutions.
Correct. So for instance, you would have, like, they had the election, there was a prime minister, could not be able to form, you know, the government, and the king actually intervened, as we know, and actually nominated someone else who's trying now to make a government. So literally, if you look at the entire narratives in the nation itself, is the fact there is no functioning government. So I just want to hear more about the resiliency itself, but also having this notion, and I speak for the probably more Moroccan case than the Jordanian case, because they were in the street, they were all asking for same things. And at the same time, I think what it was really the response of the king right away, making constitutional reform that are more like on paper than being practical, but also the fact that I also want to play the monarchy as a card in these nations, because as you know, it's like somebody who's very revered, who has this, coming back to the kind of political Islam, but Islam having this lineage that people also in the street would actually say, we have nothing wrong, we love the king, but we want something that's more functioning, which is totally different than what happened in Egypt, where you would see Sqat al-Nidam, and by that they mean exactly correct. What meaning by it, like, and then the same thing happened in Tunisia as well. And that's why I just bring this in. And my other thing, if you don't mind, just you've talked about something so important, very important in terms of how we'd reverse it. And what you said was, it's so hard to come to this reversal if you do not have political leaders or educated elite that know how to do this. And you specifically spoke about the education system as well. So that has been a perennial issue for so many years. And we can assert to say, well, all these institutions, they actually fail to, produce, as you would call, les cadres, that would be like more politically astute and would be able actually to lead those state from a brink to failure or kind of fragile to a little bit like functioning. So
Yeah.
I'm throwing a lot of things at you, so I'm just like trying to.
Yes, no, I'm not gonna try and respond to all of these, but I'll just say.
Thank you so much.
On the monarchy and the cases of Jordan and Morocco, again, simply put, in both cases, the state managed through its institutions, formal and informal, to contain and manage a political conflict and a social conflict in both cases. That means you have something that you can rely on in order to face the challenge that you're facing. Right now, those institutions include include the institutions of the political system, the formal ones, but also include things like the monarchy itself.
Absolutely.
And the respect it yields, but also the monarchy not just yields respect, but a sense of alternative costs, right? It also, in the case of Jordan, the tribal element is very important, and that's part of the informal institutions you have, and so on and so forth. Now, these are particular characteristics of a state. So I don't think you can replicate that, but what you can learn is, one is the importance of having a function, the idea that you have a functioning institution, that political institutions, again, that might seem obvious, but are meant to manage political conflicts. So when political conflicts are happening outside, please be worried, because that is going to be a security challenge if unattended for, okay? And back to your initial point of bringing the state back in, I think we all have an interest, especially those who work on security, in remembering that if you want to maintain security, you have to keep a state. So the only option you have is, do you keep a fragile, failing state by external support and keep it on some kind of a lifeline? Or is it a smarter thing, more durable, to invest in reconfiguring, maybe not reform, in reconfiguring that state in order to increase its resilience?
I actually would like to go back to Professor Owen's point about political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, because like I'm going to share my favorite piece of statistics about Egypt, that in 2011, during the first parliamentary elections of the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood got around 60% of the seats. 6 months after, during the first round of the presidential elections, their candidate got 23% of the vote, while more than 60% of the voters voted for change. I think, and Ezzedine might agree on that, is our problem was that we did not identify what this change is. Like, everybody was for change, but nobody was actually, like, most of the persons were not ready to do the hard work part of change. And I tend to agree about what Ezzedine said, that we get locked up too much about the question of political Islam, while I would rather think of it as part of how this specificity of the Arab region in the presence of frontier states, and how, like, international actors and their vested interests in some frontier states affected, like, the structure of the system itself. And this is where I want, like, to if you can, like, share some few words about how do you see, like, the system, the Arab system as regional order? How do you see, like, I think we haven't seen so many collapsed states in quite some time in one region, and we haven't seen the lack of functionality at the regional level in quite some time. And we haven't seen also, like, the rise not necessarily of political Islam, but of, like, outbreak of terrorism and governance by actors who are not necessarily subscribing to any form of what we qualify as state, Islamic state.
Well, I don't think there is an Arab or a regional order. I think that's gone.
Okay.
We're in the, a collapsed order, and we have some states collapsed, others are trying not to collapse, and others are fending for their interests. Some of them, which we would call, that's part of your external intervention, I understand, some of them actually contribute to the disorder by trying to fend for their own interests. It's a mess. This is what we have. And in this mess, it keeps on getting worse. That's all I have to say. I have nothing else to say. I mean, you literally have a bunch of states trying to stay afloat, and in this attempt, they drown others, and others are drowning, and some are already drowned.
That's very positive.
Well, it's...
Any other questions? We still have time. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is going to come out a little disorganized because I'm still trying to figure out exactly what state fragility means. Because I think that you've presented at least 3 or 4 distinct and different definitions of fragility that you pick and choose from when it suits the particular moment in time. And it seems that you're sort of bearing a normative argument in here too, which is a state is fragile when it's not providing the services that you think the state should be providing. And it seems like there are linked concepts here, one being legitimacy, one being weakness, and one being fragility. And I think that there is definitely a link between some of these things, but they're distinct enough concepts that they need to be disentangled and treated separately. And so it seems like the discussion has sort of drifted in a direction that identifies state fragility with resiliency, right? Or the ability to mitigate challenges to its cohesion, its functionality. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the state is in this regard. Is it distribution networks? Is it the regime? Is it, I mean, what? But what is missing, and I think is really surprising that it hasn't been brought up yet, is internal cohesion within the state, or how the regime is able to stick together and keep control of institutions, which frankly I don't think has anything to do with whether or not they're collecting the garbage and, generating jobs and providing good education, if they believe they don't have to do it and can continue to maintain their grips on power. Right? And so I think that there's a correlation here, but I think that it's a little bit of a spurious one. And I just don't really see what the focus of the concept is. And I'd like to just push back a little bit harder and see if we can figure out what the link between resiliency and legitimacy and service provision and all these things are.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm using the most basic definition of state failure and fragility, which is the 4 elements. You mentioned 3 of them, and the providing services adequately. Adequately is not judged by external players, it's judged by majority of the people thinking that this is minimally acceptable, right? And again, as I said, it's all scales, it's not binaries, right? So provision of services, and services are not just collecting garbage, but they're also providing health, infrastructure, transportation, education, and so on and so on, law and order, all of that, okay? A second element is the control of the territory and loss of at least part of this control. Also, loss of use of the monopoly over the use of force in a substantial way, right? The third is the legitimacy of governance institutions, whether they're seen as legitimate and as legitimate enough to make decisions for governance. And the last one is the, acting coherently on the international scene, right? Now, you can lose one of these, part of it or all of it, and all of this would kind of put you somewhere in that long index. But that part is much more controversial because you cannot turn this into quantitative indicators safely, right? But there are, you know, people who at the Peace Fund who struggle with this every year. You know, they have their own 12 criteria and so on and so forth with its flows. Now, the more you can provide those 4 things, the more resilient you are. The less resilient or the more fragile. Now, I don't understand whether you are making a distinction between fragility and resilience, or you see them as I do, which is the other side of the coin. I mean, the way I understand fragility is that it's less resilience. Do you see a distinction?
I think that's right. But
what precisely are the distinctions that you recommend we make?
Well, no, I came into this talk assuming that fragility and resiliency are sort of 2 sides of the same coin, right? But a state can be resilient in the face of a challenge stemming from its inability to provide services. And I guess if I could just give you a hypothetical, for example, let's say Donald Trump starts gutting social services left and right? You know, healthcare is gone and people don't have access to healthcare. Education is privatized and people don't have access to that. Would you make the argument that the United States has then become a fragile state because it doesn't want? So that's my question, is what is the link between these conceptions of legitimacy and the ability or desire to provide social services on the one hand and underlying resiliency of the state in the face of social challenges?
Let me try 2 distinctions. Maybe that would clarify where I'm coming from. I, with others, would distinguish between what we call state weakness or fragility. Those are equivalents, right? And the ability of a regime to survive using repression, right? So if the internal cohesion of the regime is high, its determination is, and it has at its disposition enough repression and other resources, it can survive even in a failed state. We have cases of that. Sudan, not to mention Syria, but Sudan, right? So that's about so there is an important distinction here between the internal cohesion, ability to survive, and what we call state resilience. The other distinction where Donald Trump comes in, when we talk about the provision of service, we're not talking about welfare state services necessarily. We're talking about having the FDA, Food and Drug Agency. So you have an institution somewhere that can monitor and enforce clear, more or less, regulations about safety of food for a nation. If this goes away, and then people are doubtful of the safety of what they're eating every day, this is where resilience is hit. This is where resilience is reduced. So if you have functioning hospitals, and you have a system of producing medical doctors and measuring them, and some kind of criteria that the majority of population trusts, resilience is high, whether or not they have Obamacare or some other funny Medicare or no Medicare, universal Medicare system. So it's not about the difference between the US and Canada, it's about the difference between the US and Somalia, to be extreme, where you don't know, is this person a doctor? How would you know this person is a doctor? You have no way of knowing. This person has graduated from the Faculty of Medicine, but you have no way of trusting that this person actually is a qualified doctor. And nothing in the state can tell you. So when the basic institutions, this is what is usually meant by provision of minimum service adequately, right? So when this is going down, then we're talking about state institutions being less resilient or weak, which is obviously interrelated with legitimacy and other things.
famous concept that is relevant to the case of Arab states who are not necessarily functioning, but they are surviving on repression, which is Yazid Ayyubi's fierce state, like the state that rules only by repression.
Any other questions or comments? Will you please go ahead? Last one.
Could you make just some comparison with sub-Saharan Africa? In some ways, there are, some things that invite comparison with the Arab world, like the presence of a large number of young people and also the decentralization of media and all that. But in Africa, I think the resilience of the states doesn't seem pretty much a function of service providing. Ethiopia is a good example. We have a very efficient government by all accounts. Not just to go into other stuff right now, like there are over 20 million Ethiopians on emergency food roll. If it was not for a good government that had safety nets and other services in place, we could have been in, biblical kind of famine again. But famine literally has become history in Ethiopia. We have droughts, we have several stuff. Yet, Ethiopia is under state of emergency. The government has no, if people have their way, no legitimacy at all. There is no, and I can mention other examples in Kenya and also Rwanda and all that. So just just revisiting the whole concept, just using.
Well, thank you for bringing in the sub-Saharan African dimension. I actually forgot to mention Ghana, which is a case, a celebrated case of reversing state fragility. So that's the only case that we have in that regard. I am not an expert at all on sub-Saharan Africa. My knowledge of sub-Saharan Africa is probably 1 year I spent there with the UN and all that, but which is not a guarantee for knowledge in particular. But the case of Ethiopia, the case you mentioned, point to the link between the political and the technocratic, or the technical. The question is not just technical. State resilience is not just being able to provide services. It's all these things together. So you can be able to provide services, but your institutions lack legitimacy, including or in particular political institutions. Or you provide services, but the political institutions aren't functioning at all. Case, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In terms of provision of service, very sophisticated system of provision of service, a higher standard livings than many other Arab states. But then the failure is, on the political side, staggering, where you don't have a political system to speak of. Now, even if you have some aspects of functionality, if the overall fragility is high, you can be surprised by a sudden security collapse or a sudden security challenge. So you can be very good at transportation, internal trade, distributing food, and systems of emergency, but politically, the system is not working in the sense that political conflicts are happening outside institutions, formal and informal, then it explodes. Then it can explode. Right? And again, provision of service would include, in addition to this, rule of law, law and order, and not just political enforcement, political order. It is, you lose a car, do you go to the police station, or you know that there's no point? Do you settle the problem outside or not? When you go to the police station, do they give you a number of someone you call so that you can retrieve your car and pay a ransom, or they have a system of dealing with crime, right? So all of this is about how the institutions themselves are working. And again, those are political issues.
I guess we have 1 minute, but I want to ask something very quick I've not heard. But like, in terms of looking at the fragility or resilience at all these certain nation balances and check, but I'm more thinking about civil society and the watchdog organization and what kind of role they play. Because you would see with all the Arab Spring, you have a lot of advocacy group, you have watchdogs, you have people talking about human rights. And I just want to hear a little bit about the watchdog, the transparency issues and all, in terms of, because we talk about recognition, in terms of leader being recognized, but I want to see what kind of role all these advocacy group, watchdogs, and all different organizations play in this question of fragility, resiliency.
Thank you. I think it's a very good point, a very good question, and it points to an omission also in my presentation. The way I refer when I talk about institutions, sometimes I say state institutions, but I don't mean exclusively state institutions. I think I have mixed up state and country in my presentation, and what I mean is the institutions that are available to what we would call social formation, right? So that includes civil society. If civil society, the more robust, effective civil society organizations you have, the more effective and robust and resilient the social formation is with its institutions. So again, thank you for that.
Thank you so much for being here, and please join me in thanking Professor Fisher for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.